Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is your program featuring religious liberty news and evaluation from the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty Magazine, and my guest on this program is Carmela. I hesitate on your name all the time, as I've said before, because I knew you before you were married, but it's Carmela Monk Crawford.
That's right. You got it.
Carmela Monk for me always, but you've got a good husband and a good name.
Amen.
Let's talk about the world as she is. The US has gone through an interesting period in the recent years. And by the way, I'm older than I ever thought I would get to be. And I'm doing numbers lately, and proportionate numbers. Like I've been alive for half the time of Liberty Magazine, not editor, nearly 20 years editor. But you know, that's a short-term period. But when I look at the history of the US, I can remember a lot of the presidents. I think I've been alive about a quarter of the history of the US.
Wow.
Since independence, something like that. I better be careful because I haven't done the subs lately. But, you know, so we think it's ancient history, but any grown adult really has a good compass of events in their own memory. And by my life memory, we're in a period of rapid devolution. Things are just crazy at the moment. And I can't remember a period when religion has been so politically aligned as it is at the moment. As a kid, I remember the fear, I was in Australia at the time, but the fear that John F. Kennedy might win the presidential election, and as a Roman Catholic, back when this was an overtly Protestant country, you know, might do something untoward on religious freedom. Turned out not to be the case.
Right.
He understood the separation of church and state. But what do you make today of this incredible alliance between some of the leading evangelical figures and forces and the present administration?
Wow. What a loaded question. First of all, I think it is unfortunate, I'd have to say, it is unfortunate that a few of the more vocal and more politically connected people have set the agenda from a religious point of view. When we look at the greed that underlies and underpins so much that we have going on in the country, when we look at the militarism, when we look at the nationalism or the national pride, and we look at the rise in civil rights and problems like this, and we see—
You're calling it nationalism. We used to call it jingoism.
Yes, yes. Well, when we look at these—
This is not true nationalism, it's jingoism.
It's jingoism. When we look at these things that are happening and we see that there's a certain group, many would say that the evangelicals have been so influential in leading the way in terms of determining what is important from a religious standpoint.
And they've done some good things.
They've done some good things.
It's not all bad.
Yeah, let's not, and I don't mean to paint with such a broad brush.
I do it too, so I understand where you're going.
In a very real sense, I'm an evangelical. But I do believe that the religious landscape and the places in which we can insert ourselves is so much broader than the gun debate or the abortion debate or any one of the narrow things, prayer in schools. When we see that children don't have water at home, then we have to realize, you know, it's more than just a few small issues.
Maybe not even prayer at home.
Yeah, well, maybe not prayer at home, but I'm saying, you know, I guess my emphasis is on the focus of a few issues and the focus on individual responsibility and why can't you do this and why aren't you where you need to be, and let's get you going by cutting you off or taking you off of the public dole or getting you out of public housing and all that sort of thing. And I don't mean this to be from a political standpoint. I'm saying from a religious standpoint, they have articulated what they believe are the important issues. I believe it's so much bigger. And that's how I believe as a Christian, Jesus was so much more comprehensive. You know, your religion has to be way bigger.
There's no evidence that Jesus was politically oriented.
I don't agree with that, but I do believe that.
The main thing he said at the end, he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my fellows would fight for me."
But how interesting, though.
He was a political critic. He called Herod that old fox.
That old fox.
That was a pretty heavy thing.
That's pretty good.
Back in those days, and right up through very close to the time of even after the American Revolution. I don't know if you know the Alien and Sedition Acts in the US. It was a capital offense to criticize the president.
Correct.
I don't know they actually executed anyone, but they were ready to do it.
Yeah.
So in that era, he could have been crucified for that alone.
And I don't, maybe political in the narrow sense, but certainly the things that Jesus cared about and talked about had political implications. Right. And certainly the vulnerable that people say, let's not talk about that because that's political. The vulnerable are who Jesus talked about and who he cared about.
And I agree with you. And this is a good time for me to throw in the qualifier on it that people tend to forget. I hear all the time politicians, when there's some big issue at hand, saying, I'm not being political on this.
Right.
And of course they're being political because it's a political issue, they're a political player. What they really mean and what we should qualify is I'm not being partisan or party-oriented. Everything that religious liberty has to deal with, and that Liberty magazine, and I think even your magazine deals with, has political ramifications. Right. You can't avoid that. Right. You're dealing with society. That's political. But we do need to avoid, like the plague, partisan party affiliation. But at the moment, we have the counter to that with a number of the leading religious figures. They've joined themselves at the hip. Yes. To a political administration and the party that goes with it.
To a fault.
Now, that's their right as citizens, but as religious leaders, I think it's improper.
I think I tend to agree with you. I think, sadly, because there is so much momentum in that direction, the counterbalance looks like you have to align yourself with the opposing party, which I wish that was not the case. I wish there was a happy medium where we can talk and dialogue with Christians who say, look at these issues and this is what I want to do about this, and I'm not going to blindly follow anybody. But you asked me...
We should be issue-oriented, not party-oriented.
I agree with that.
And we should be working for justice and freedom for all people.
Yeah, so you asked me...
dealing with a party, it starts to narrow down. There's party interests, not national interests.
Right.
And if nothing else, they've lent their credibility, or their church's credibility, to an effort to exclude people. These quite broad exclusions for people from other countries. That's not really a Christian view, even though you understand the paranoia that lies behind it, but that's not a Christian way to deal with it. No, and I agree that it's not a Christian way. And worse, it goes directly against the clearly stated aims of the framers in the Treaty of Tripoli. The treaty it says this country's for all people. It's not Christian. It's not a Christian republic. It's for the Mohammedan and so on. Well, people of other faiths start to wonder. If you don't like my religion, and some elements of it might be problematic, but you'll keep me out because of that. A broad brush, that's not right. And here, Christian leaders have lent their support to something that's not charitable nor legal in the truest understanding of what America stands for.
But it goes so much deeper. You have to wonder what is behind that. Why, when on the face of this even, we are separating families. On the face of this, we are applying our immigration laws and our deep history of welcoming the stranger and the foreigner and the immigrant. Why, even on the face of this, when this is inconsistent with who we are as a country, why we are willing to do this now? I think
narrow interest. It's not a concern for the stranger that's within your gates or what's to come within your gates.
Or the marginalization and the othering. I know that you covered that and
you read Liberty.
That.
We had an article on othering. And other is, in fact, in some languages, the word for a stranger or a non-member of your society, it's another. They're not human, even often. It's
Right.
just some. It's not to be equated with real people.
Right.
And I believe human beings naturally want to connect with other human beings. So to act badly toward them, or in war to even harm them, you have to dehumanize them, other them.
You have to
And this, with a broad brush, say everyone from there is dangerous, they might bomb you or whatever, that turns them into sort of terrorist ciphers rather than human beings.
Right, and not taking the time to create either a structure or an inquiry that would allow you to separate an actual threat from someone who is not a threat, and avoiding the broad brush. But I think it's interesting. I was reading an article not too long ago, and I think it is the same, some of the same sources and information that you covered. The article was talking about, and this is a quote from a man from a place called Genocide Watch. I'm saying this with a smile. I don't know why I'm saying it with a smile. It's very scary information about the patterns, and they go around the world and they discover, what leads to this horrific event where people, where they turn on each other, and it's like you said, dehumanizing somebody else or distancing their wants, their basic human rights, their basic human needs from my rights and my human needs, and then separating them and putting them aside, I guess, in the discussion, in the dialogue. And then, as you saw, I guess, with Hitler's Germany, you saw in Rwanda, there's a physical distance put aside. And then you have the point where you actually get to where people are actually wholesale wiping others out. But it starts with that dialogue in the beginning, in which we can distance ourselves and make the other seem inhuman.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a correct dynamic. But to have Christian leaders implicit or complicit in this is troubling to me to the extreme. I've lived in the US long enough, and you're right, there's a tradition of welcoming the stranger. I mean, it's written in poetry. Emma Lazarus' words are inscribed there under the Statue of Liberty. And, if you know US history, it's been fits and starts. But I've seen something clearly shifting relatively recently, all during the Cold War, which is most of my formative period, and yours too, I'm sure.
Some of it, yeah.
Yeah, not as much. I don't know your age, or you shouldn't know mine, but still, I'm a little old. But, most of my life, all of my life was in the Cold War. I mean, I was born after World War II, just to clarify that. But the US consciously set itself up to be a Christian nation versus godless communism. So we had linked, sometimes improperly, our Christian identity with our political stance, and we would welcome refugees from communism on that level. With the collapse of the Berlin Wall, something changed. I saw it almost overnight. We didn't need to keep up what had become more of a fiction because we had stresses, economic and so on. We didn't really so viscerally welcome people anymore, and now we didn't need to be a counterpoint to godless communism. Was gone. So the doors started closing. And I think we've come to an incredible pass where I didn't actually see the footage yet, but at the border, they shot across the border at someone trying to enter and killed them. I mean, that is shades of the Cold War.
Yes.
We've become the polar opposite.
Yes.
And Christians need to look at ourselves and at our community and our nation. How are we presenting? Let's take a short break. We'll be back to continue this discussion, and hopefully we'll get into more trenchant details on why Christianity and Christian leaders have thought to have political alliances at a time when there's a moral complexity that they're buying into. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break, I was probably making your head spin with the different connections I was trying to make, but all starting from what we're living through in the US, an unprecedented alliance of a number of religious leaders with the aims and and policies of an administration and a political party. That's always dangerous, isn't it?
It's always dangerous, and we see that in the establishment of in the opening of the new embassy in Jerusalem.
I was wanting to get onto that.
And we see the backing and the complete confidence that this is going to play out the way we want it to play out for certain groups, which is a scary prospect for me. But even, and this is my point all along, is that even if this is something that you hold close, this is something that you believe needs to happen for the end of the world, which I don't ascribe to that point of view, but there are many people who believe that. There has to be something within your heart that says, when you mow down 50 people with gunfire on the same day, is this the way that we want this to go? When we injure more than 200 people in the opening, in this glorious opening of this embassy, is this really where we are being led?
Well, and even to say it, you're risking people coming at you because that's not supportive, say, of Israel.
I know that.
But your point is correct, because by casting the lot of the church in with a political goal, then a moral ambiguity that happens at the same time can't be spoken of, because your view is that you're supporting the embassy and the US's role, and that's an inconvenient truth, to borrow an Al Gore comment. We should be able to speak to the morality of whatever happens, but we can't. It's muzzling the church.
It's muzzling the church.
Muzzling the church and compromising the church. I don't think it should speak at all to whether Israel has legitimacy or whether we have empathy toward those that, or their recent ancestors that escaped the Holocaust, to critique that action. But the way it's set up, no, you dare not, because in this case, the Palestinians are far, far worse. It's basically a global situation ethics.
Right, right. And it is one that tests our ideas and how far, or our understanding of religious liberty and religious practice. If, obviously that is the worst case scenario, to have the major religions of the world laying claim to the same territory and the same important space. And yes, we have to find and learn from the same, or impart the same principles.
Something is going to happen there, and we don't know, and prophecy doesn't directly speak to it. But I'm inclined to think it's going to become a religious safe zone with, who knows, someone, perhaps even the Roman pontiff might set up as the chairman of the board there.
Well, that's a prediction that you, I don't know.
On this program, I've said before, years ago, we had an interview with the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And we spoke about the agreement between Pope John Paul II and Arafat. They signed a contract. And he said, yes, the Holy Father, as he called him, is intimately involved with the disposition of Jerusalem. It would make sense. In fact, if I didn't have a prophetic sense and a sense of separation of church and state, I would say, fine, make it a religiously open city and put perhaps one of the most respected religious leaders there to sort of preside over it. But unfortunately, it will lead to more of the same. But in the US, at least, I just think there needs to be a deconnection of political leaders and figures, religious leaders from political figures. Someone that I'll name him because he's a very public figure, the lawyer with the American Center for Law and Justice. In fact, I won't name him, but he's well known, well, secular. I appreciated a lot of what he did. Stood very powerfully for some of the things that Liberty's reported on over the years, religious prejudice cases and free exercise and so on. But here, he and his fellows joined ranks with this administration. He became legal counsel of the president. And lawyers defend the indefensible on occasion. But it just seems to me you can't move your religious program and take it in to the center of profanity. and expect that you're morally pure anymore. It's sad. That's what I mostly see in this. Not so much dangerous as sad.
It's sad.
And people that many of them objected to a previous presidential candidate because they didn't like his religion. And now someone, and those around him have no particular religion or religious ambiguity, fine, because he'll do what they want. That's expediency of the highest degree. Of course, there have been Cyruses and others in the past that have mandated things that have benefited God's people, but don't call them the promised one.
And sadly, this is where we are.
But that's where people that have no spiritual perception go.
Right.
And so my prayer is that in the United States it rediscovers its origins and the Constitution, separation of church and state for the government, and for society, rediscover practical religion for the community.
Right.
You know, a godless, profane culture cannot become religious again by joining the priests and the legislators.
But that is exactly what has happened.
Yeah.
We're expecting the people that previously we have not expected to carry that flag, to do that for us, and we are sort of endorsing by you know, our support for them.
And I know you featured some things on the Reformation last year, and the Reformation was Western culture breaking loose of that dynamic.
Right, right.
We're delivering it back again.
Right.
It may not happen right away, but we're clearly drifting back into that enchanted ground.
Well, and you know, you mentioned that particular story or set of articles that we ran in Message. Our whole take is, you know, it's 500 years of protest. And as an African,
protest out.
Yeah, we're going to continue to protest, and because there are so many different facets that you have to continue to watch, especially the ones where the rubber meets the road and it affects people on a day-to-day basis. And so, like we said before, as we see the religious groups backing the administration, but we see so many vulnerable people pushed out at the same time. Shouldn't it have the opposite effect? Shouldn't it not only have the effect of allowing people to understand and have a broader spiritual effect, but also uplift their lives? But we're seeing as this force and the religious influence get together, and what we know from prophecy is it is not a lifting of all boats. We're seeing people lose their lives.
And you used the term, and I understood it, but I want to pick up on it. You know, backing. There's nothing wrong with religious leaders backing in the sense of being supportive of a government on something particular. But to be wholesale supporters is always dangerous. Billy Graham, who recently died, had a checkered history, but overall he was a strong moral force in the US. But toward the end, he said that he had made a mistake in becoming so politically identified with these different presidents. You know, he got to the point where in the back room, he's sort of suggesting policy that they should take, and they listened to him because of his moral clout. That wasn't really right.
I counted that, not counter, but in comparison, we just did a story featuring Chaplain Barry Black, the United States Senate.
He's in a pivotal position, isn't he?
Pivotal, very interesting position. But his whole thing is that I can, based on my reading of the Bible, based on my relation, I can bring about my views from both philosophy, from my spiritual standpoint, and my reading of the Bible without being partisan. And I don't have to weigh in on every issue, but I can give my perspective. And I believe that's an interesting.
And I've heard him say a number of times. And once years ago, he told me privately, he believes that he's sort of a Daniel put there at a pivotal time and place.
I asked him that. He says, no, I'm Barry. Barry.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, there's no question. But there's more like him. He's not the only one. And we need to say it. There's a positive aspect of people of faith planted in these positions, and they're not open about it, but their faith determines how they react.
Right.
But they're not promoting their identity.
Right, right. I hope to see more of that. I love the fact that Barry Black was such a great and outspoken and spiritual representative.
At a recent Liberty dinner, I had a special opportunity to bring a brief welcome to the attendees from the Washington establishment. not wanting to be openly critical of what's happening with church involvement in politics, I said that lately there has been the appeal of the Milvian Bridge and the Claremont solution. The Milvian Bridge was the calling card of Constantine when he took over civil control of Christianity, and the other was the proclamation of the First Crusade that led in a very dangerous and violent direction for Christianity. I'm afraid that today many Christian leaders in the United States, in their search for power, are risking the Milvian Bridge and even the Claremont solution to what is at root religious conflict in our world today. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.